Hello, I'm Eleanor Sill Milholland, granddaughter of George Brackett, the founder of Edmonds. Welcome to the early history of Edmonds, Washington. Edmonds is located on a sloping hillside north of Seattle and south of Everett. In the year 2000, there are 38,600 people living in Edmonds. But in 1870, the city was only a vision in the mind of my grandfather, George Brackett.
Before the arrival of white settlers, the area of Edmonds was used by people from several native tribes in the area. These tribes were related to each other because they had a common language, Lushootseed. The Suquamish people came from Kingston to gather cattails and reeds for weaving. The Snohomish and Snoqualmie people collected clams and fished in this area. The people also followed trails to Kenmore, where they had encampments to fish in Lake Washington. They lived among the many large trees and dense underbrush. Some of these people continued to live in the area after the city was started. In 1841, an English explorer, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, named the point just south of Edmonds. He named it Point Edmond. 25 years later, in 1866, a man named Pleasant H. Elwell filed the first land claim for the area of Edmonds. In 1870, a young logger named George Brackett left his home in Ballard and went up the coast looking for trees that he could log. He was in a canoe and a storm was coming in, so he paddled to shore. He liked the slope of the land because it would be easy to get the logs to the water, and it would be easy to build on. So, 2 years later, in 1872, George Brackett returned to buy land in the area. He paid $650 for 147 acres of timberland. This land was sold to him by the Fowler brothers and M.H. Frost, who had bought the land from Mr. Elwell. George Brackett was married in 1875 to Miss Etta Jones. In the next year, he had a son, George Jr. In 1876, George Brackett moved his family to the land he had bought. He brought along his oxen and his logging equipment. He built a temporary house and started his logging operation. The Brackett's second child was a girl, Fanny Brackett, who was born on August 3, 1879. She was the first white child born in Edmonds. Over the next few years, the area where the Bracketts lived was known as Brackett's Landing. From 1876 to 1883, settlers were arriving in the Brackett's Landing area. They arrived by boat because the woods and undergrowth were too dense for travel by land. These settlers began homesteading, building wharves and starting businesses. In 1883, the first sawmill was built inland by Mr. Charles Breed. Also in 1883, George Brackett built a public wharf to serve as the town's boat landing. It was at the foot of Bell Street. He also built a small general store near the wharf. This was the first store in Edmonds, and the Bracketts also lived in part of the building. The next year, 1884, was an important year for Edmonds. George Brackett sent in an application to start a post office. When the application was accepted, he had to think of a name for the town. Brackett was a long-time admirer of Senator George Edmonds of Vermont. Also, he may have known about the point south of Edmonds having been named Point Edmond. So, Mr. Brackett chose Edmonds as the name of the town. When the name of the town was sent to the Postal Service office in Washington, D.C., the clerks there read Mr. Brackett's handwriting as Edmonds. No one corrected the mistake, and the town was named Edmonds. The first post office was in George Brackett's store. The mail was carried by a man on horseback. He went along Indian trails through the woods between Edmonds and Bothell once or twice a week. Also in 1884, the Edmonds School District No. 15 was started. Classes were held in Mr. Brackett's feed barn at the corner of 3rd and Edmonds Street. Lighting was kerosene lamps, and there was no running water or indoor plumbing. There were 6 students enrolled, and their teacher was Miss Emily Box. Miss Box did not have her own apartment. She stayed at each student's house for a while before moving on to the next student's house. The teacher's salary was $20 per month. Some of the students lived too far away to walk to school, so they stayed with a family in town during the week and went home on weekends. In 1886, the first one-room schoolhouse was built. It was just north of George Street, which is now called Main Street. George Brackett donated the land and lumber for the school. The school only ran for 3 months out of the year. A new postmaster, Mr. Heiner, took over from George Brackett in 1887. At the time, the mail came by steamer boat from Seattle. If the tide was out, Mr. Heiner would have to row out to the steamer and pick up the mail, since the steamer couldn't get into the dock. Mr. Heiner's house even had a cupola on the top, so that his children could keep a lookout for the mail boats. In 1888, a lot of changes came to the city of Edmonds. New families arrived, a hotel was opened, another general store was established, a cigar factory started production, and the first church in Edmonds, the Congregational Church, was organized. Edmonds also got its first marshal, Mr. Roscoe, who also served as an unofficial mayor. The growth of Edmonds continued in 1889. George Brackett built the first sawmill and loading dock on the waterfront to make shingles. The first drugstore was opened. There were 2 brick factories that started production. A logging camp was started north of the town by James Curry. He had a shingle mill, a wharf, and a 2-mile track with a rail car. The first justice of the peace, George Bartlett, arrived and performed the first marriage in Edmonds between Frank Millspaugh and Dot Watkins. A dance hall was built, which later became the Free Methodist Church. Also in 1889, the school was enlarged because there were 32 students. On November 11, 1889, Washington became the 42nd state of the United States. Throughout the early years of Edmonds' history, logging was the major industry. Logs were cut down, brought together, and chained together. In the early years, these logs were hooked to oxen or put on big wagons. Later, horses and mules were also used to drag the chained logs to the mills. Often, the loggers would use a skid road. This special road was built with logs placed one after another. It ran along the base of Union Oil Hill, at the southern boundary of the marsh, and on to the Sound. Some of the logging companies hauled logs right down Main Street. If logs were being taken down hills, chutes were made. These chutes were built from logs and made a trough for the logs to slide down in. Sometimes the logs slid very fast, since grease was often used. This made the logs rub against the chute and get hot. The loggers had to put water in the chute to keep the logs from catching fire. The logs were used by shingle and lumber companies. The sawmills cut the logs into lumber for building homes and other buildings. The shingle mills used cedar trees. When the cedar tree was cut down, the branches were shaved off. Then the logs were sent to Edmonds, where the shingle mills were on the waterfront. At the mills, the cedar logs were cut into pieces. These pieces were called shingle bolts. The shingle bolts were taken to the big saws and then made into shingles. The shingles were thicker at one end than the other, so the men at the saws had to keep turning the bolts so that the thick end of the shingle was not taken off the same end each time. The men who did this job were called shingle weavers, because of the way they had to weave back and forth as they worked. Often in these jobs, men lost fingers. 1890 was another important year for Edmonds. The Great Northern Railway was headed for Edmonds, so the Minneapolis Realty and Investment Company bought 455 acres from George Brackett. They wanted to use Edmonds as a center for railroad operations. Mr. Brackett still had land in the area. Many new structures were built. The Bishop Hotel, the Alameda Hotel, an office building, a new general store, a stone pier, and a wharf at the end of George, Main Street. The new wharf was long enough to make it easier for the steamers to dock at Edmonds during low tide. Steamers came every day to Edmonds for the first time. Edmonds was incorporated as a fourth-class village on August 11, 1890. The people had to sign a petition asking the state to make Edmonds an official village. The petition had to be signed with 72 signatures. When George Brackett realized there were only 70 signatures, he added the names of his two oxen, Bolivar and Isaac. George Brackett was elected as the first official mayor. Mr. A.M. Yost arrived in town with less than $10 in his pocket. He and his family became some of the major contributors to the development of Edmonds. The first newspaper also started in 1890. It was called the Edmonds Chronicle. In June of 1891, a track-laying engine belonging to the Great Northern Railroad arrived in Edmonds. It was laying track from Everett, going south. The new track was completed in 1892. Yet again, school attendance had grown out of the school building. Classes were temporarily held in Mr. Brackett's hall, just south of his feed barn. The new school was built at 7th and Main. It was called Edmonds Grade School and later became the Francis Anderson Center. In 1893, the Minneapolis Realty and Investment Company was not able to keep up the payments on the land they had bought from George Brackett, so they left and the land went back to Mr. Brackett. Up until this point, most people got their water from wells and streams. Mr. Brackett asked the city if he could lay a 6-inch water main from the springs in the south end of town into the town. The pipes for this system were made out of cedar. These early years of the 1890s were hard times financially. Edmonds didn't grow quite as fast as before. But there were many businesses, and in 1894, a company from Pennsylvania was given 120 acres to build an iron foundry. This plant would make the iron bands used to hold bundles of shingles together. In 1895, the Hatch and Bosner shingle mill bought an electric generator for their mill. This generator supplied lights for the mill and the owners of the mill. In 1899, a tax was established to pay for improving the streets. All the men between the ages of 21 and 50 had to pay $2 or work one day during the year on the streets. At that time, the roads were still either dirt or timber or plank roads. The Sunset Telegraph and Telephone Company of Everett was allowed to put up poles and string wires in the town of Edmonds in 1899. The lines would come from Bothell on trees. On July 31st of 1900, the first telephone service was installed. There was a small switchboard put in the Heiner home, and 16-year-old Ruth Heiner was the first telephone operator. There were only 5 telephones in Edmonds. The calls that were made were long distance because they were put through Bothell. The telephone lines were not very reliable because they would blow down often. In January of 1900, the W.D. Perkins firm turned on their newly installed water system. They had put in 10 hydrants in downtown Edmonds. The city refused to pay for the water service because the water pressure was not strong enough to make a fire hose squirt. Plans to purchase a fire hose were canceled by the city council. Another city wharf was started in 1901 at George Street, and it was finished 1 year later in 1902. The telephone switchboard and post office moved out of Heiner's house and into a building on Bell Street. Library service came to Edmonds by steamboat. The books were brought to town every 3 months by the Washington State Traveling Library Committee. In 1902, the Edmonds Town Hall cost $84 to build. It was located at 5th and Bell Street. For the first time, the town marshal, Frank Shiner, received a metal star as a symbol of his authority to enforce the laws. The next year, in 1903, he finally got a telephone. Also in 1903, Allen Yost and his son created the Edmonds Spring Water Company. They bought the existing water system. For the first time, there was a curfew set up. It said that children under 15 years of age could not roam the streets after 8 p.m. in the wintertime and 9 p.m. in the summer. A bell was rung at curfew time to let the children know to go home. In 1904, a volunteer fire department was formed. It had a two-wheeled hose cart which was pulled through the streets to the fire by the firemen. By 1905, there were approximately 1,000 people in Edmonds. There were then 10 miles of graded streets around Edmonds. Many people may not know it, but there was a roller skating rink that opened in Edmonds in 1906. It was located in Keeler's Pavilion on 2nd Street. In the 1900s, farming was thriving in the area around Edmonds. Some of these farmers had come from Sweden, and the area where they lived in the north end of town was called New Sweden. Strawberries were grown to be sent by train to Seattle and other destinations. Later, as roads were put in, and people came through Edmonds by car, the farmers set up stands along the road to sell directly to people out for a drive. Eventually, the strawberry plants were destroyed by insects called strawberry weevils, and the farmers began growing cherries. In 1908, the town council bought a 10-acre tract on the west side of 3rd Avenue from Emma H. Urban for $4,000. They planned to make this area into a city park. The population of Edmonds at that time was 1,546. Edmonds had an election to raise the town from a 4th-class town to a 3rd-class city. The people voted to support this change. In 1910, John Lockwood, the new librarian of the Edmonds Library, received a gift from Andrew Carnegie to build a new library on 5th Avenue near Bell Street. The building was completed in 1911. When it was completed, the city also used the building for city offices, which were under the library. A new high school had been planned in 1909 and was completed in 1910. In May of that year, the high school graduated its first class. The Great Northern Railroad put a second set of tracks through Edmonds. This allowed 8 trains to stop each day. However, the train service was unreliable due to landslides, bad weather, and poor track conditions. A.M. Yost became the first resident of Edmonds to own a car. His family went on to open an automobile agency and service station, and to operate a bus service both for transporting students to the schools in Edmonds and to take people to Seattle. Gordon Maxwell, a former mayor of Edmonds, recalled that Mr. Yost often let the high school students drive the school buses. In 1912, laws were passed to set speed limits in Edmonds. These limits were 10 miles an hour in the business district and 15 miles an hour elsewhere. For several years after this, many projects were completed to improve the roads around Edmonds. Some of the roads were paved with brick, and later many roads were paved with concrete. Main Street, from 5th to 9th, was finally paved in 1928. Fires. There were many fires within Edmonds in the early years. The first major fire was in 1890 when George Brackett's mill was burned to the ground. There were a lot of mill fires through the next 60 years. In addition, the downtown area had 2 major fires. In 1909, there was a fire at 4th and Main. All of the buildings between the alley and the street were burned to the ground. The fire department volunteers were not able to control the blaze. The Beeson building was built on the spot 2 years later, and then, in 1928, the Beeson building was damaged when the building across the alley caught fire. This major fire severely damaged 3 downtown buildings. The Yost Garage was used as the first fire station. They had both the hose cart and later the fire truck in the garage. The first true fire station wasn't built until 1960 at 5 Corners. Gordon Maxwell, who was the mayor of Edmonds from 1964 to 1967, remembers the early years of the volunteer fire department in Edmonds.
Also, the firemen got paid $1.50 or $2 for a call, but they only got paid for answering calls inside the city limits. So one time somebody set fire, one of Yost, remember those bus shelters they used to have? Set a fire up on Olympic Avenue, I think it was, and it was on the east side of the street. That was outside of the city. So I was up there and I said, haw, 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 you don't get paid for this. That's on the that's outside the city. So Phil Allen says, "Come on, gang," and they picked it up and carried it over the other side of the street and then put the fire out. So they got paid for it.
Childhood in Edmonds in the early years. Many of the people who grew up in early Edmonds have fond memories of their childhoods. Mrs. Adrienne Swanson, who was known as Dot, was born in 1904. In 1984, when she was 80 years old, she was asked to reminisce about growing up in Edmonds. The following is a reading from the essay that she wrote for that occasion, which took place May 16, 1984. It is read by Dot's friend, Eleanor Sill Milholland, who grew up with Dot.
For children, the charm of Edmonds in those early days was its bells, whistles, and its many cricks finding their way to the bay. As a child, you could wake to the 6 a.m. mill whistles, 2 blows for each mill, and name the mill that blew them. On spring mornings, if you were lucky enough to wake real early, you could lie in your warm bed and listen to the song of the meadowlark from the open fields. On Sunday mornings, you could name the church ringing its own bell. The big bell hanging in the scaffold tower back of the jail was for fire and 8 o'clock curfew. The insistent grade school bell was to hurry lagging feet. Of course, the train had a bell and whistle too. The bell warned at crossings and the whistle deafened you at close range. 4 whistles was a call for the railroad crew. Trouble on the tracks, which usually meant that a wandering cow had been hit. The cow catcher on the locomotive kept the cow from being run over, but more than likely it was so injured that it had to be destroyed. If the owner was informed in time, the beef could be saved. Shell Creek was the largest of the many cricks. For the kids in my part of town, Shell Creek was an important part of our world. In those days, there was no 9th Avenue and no Main Street above what is now 9th. There was just woods. Once we followed the creek upstream through gullies, devil clubs, maidenhair ferns, and slapping branches to its beginning, we came to a trickle coming out of the earth. Shell Creek had 4 bridges that I knew of. The bridge back of Peabody's was our favorite. It was made of huge, unsplit logs, a low bridge with no railings. In the summer, we would lie on our stomachs on those sun-warmed logs and watch the minnows flick the fine-grained sand in the little shaded side pools of the creek. Or if it was real hot, we would take off our shoes and stockings and jump into the creek for cooling. We called it splashing. That place was like a page out of a lovely storybook, an open area protected by surrounding trees, maples, wild cherry, hazelnut, fir, alder, and a rare spruce. Birdsong and the babbling of the creek echoed through the woods. Now and then a chipmunk or a frightened pheasant caught our attention. The clean-smelling beaches were ours for sand castles and swimming. The log booms were our diving boards, and we warmed our shivering selves in the steam escaping from the pop-off valves of the shingle mill nearest us. On glorious springtime Saturdays, free from school, the day wasn't wasted, even if a rainstorm threatened. Sap was running in the alder and elderberry trees, and we would make a dash for the nearest swamp and woods for branches. Then back to our woodshed with its wood chip covered earth floor and blocks of wood to sit on, as we fashioned our whistles from the alder and squirt guns from the elder. The rain on the roof seemed to try its darndest to drown out our laughter. Our alley was for playing marbles, scrub baseball, hide-and-go-seek, and run-sheep-run. Our street was for pump-pump pull-away until the curfew rang. We walked on homemade stilts, rode our wagons, and skated on the new cement sidewalk and flew homemade kites. The bells and the whistles and the small cricks are gone, and the fields with their song of the lark have vanished. Edmonds has grown up.